The pen was already in my hand when I saw it. Not my name. I sat there for a second, just staring at the line, thinking I'd misread it. I blinked. Read it again. The name on that line was not mine. It was my mother-in-law's. And my husband, sitting right next to me, smiled and said, "Just sign it, babe. We can sort out the name thing later. $420,000. My money, my savings, my 7 years of working 60-hour weeks, skipping vacations, eating lunch at my desk." And the man I'd been married to for 3 years was sitting there, calm as anything, telling me to sort it out later. I didn't sign. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to the beginning, because none of this makes sense unless you understand who I was when I met him and who I thought he was. I was 28 when I started my company. Not a tech startup, nothing glamorous, a medical billing consultancy. I know, not exactly the thing people make YouTube videos about, but I'd spent 4 years working as a billing coordinator for a group of orthopedic surgeons, and I watched them hemorrhage money every single month because their billing was a disaster. Denied claims, missed deadlines, wrong codes. I started doing contract work on the side, fixing it. Word spread. By the time I left my full-time job, I had 6 clients. By the time I turned 30, I had 22. I wasn't rich, but I was stable in a way most people my age weren't, and I knew it. I owned a small townhouse in the suburbs of Columbus, Ohio. I had no debt except the mortgage. I had a retirement account I actually contributed to. I had a business that was genuinely growing. What I didn't have was time for anything else. My friends were getting married, having kids, taking trips to Portugal. I was revealing EOBs at 10 o'clock on a Friday night. I told myself I'd figure out the personal stuff later. Later kept getting pushed back. I met my husband at a work conference in Indianapolis. He was in pharmaceutical sales at the time, charming, easy to talk to, the kind of person who makes you feel like the most interesting person in the room within 5 minutes of meeting you. We talked for 3 hours at the hotel bar. He remembered everything I said. He asked follow-up questions. He laughed at the right moments. I know what you're thinking. I know. We did long distance for 8 months before he relocated to Columbus. We got engaged 14 months after that. I remember my best friend, Tara, asking me once if I thought we were moving fast. I told her we weren't that young. I said I knew what I wanted. The wedding was small. Backyard ceremony at his parents' place in Delaware, Ohio. 40 people. His mother, I'll call her what she was, the architect of most of what came later, stood in the front row in a beige dress she'd bought without telling me, even though I'd specifically asked her to wear navy. A small thing. I noted it and let it go. I should not have let it go. I kept my business in my name after we married. That part wasn't even a discussion. It was my company, I'd built it, it stayed mine. But I was naive about what mine really meant once we shared a life. He started being present at client dinners. He knew my revenue numbers. He knew which contracts were coming up for renewal and which clients were shaky. I talked about work at home because work was my life, and he was my husband, and that's what married people do. I told him everything. That was mistake number 1. About 18 months into the marriage, we started talking about buying an investment property. We'd been going back and forth on it for a while, something we could eventually rent out or use as a vacation place. He brought it up again right after I'd closed my biggest contract to date, a 3-year deal with a regional hospital network. The timing feels obvious to me now. It didn't then. He had a specific property in mind. A condo in a building downtown, newer construction, good location, the kind of place that would rent easily. The asking price was $420,000. We sat down and looked at the finances together. My finances, really. He was still in sales at that point, and his income was variable. I had the savings. I had the credit score. I had the assets. I agreed to buy it, in my name, with my money, as part of my overall investment portfolio. I made the offer. It was accepted. We went into contract. I was happy. I was genuinely, stupidly happy. The closing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at 10. It was at the title company's office, one of those beige carpeted conference rooms with a fake plant in the corner and a bowl of wrapped mints on the table. The realtor, a woman I'd met twice, pleasant enough, name was something I've since scrubbed from my memory, was already there when we arrived. So was my mother-in-law. I stopped in the doorway. "What is she doing here?" "Mom wanted to be here," my husband said, already walking past me, already kissing her on the cheek. "She's excited for us." I stood there for a moment. I've been at closings before. You don't bring your mother to a closing. Your mother is not a party to the transaction, but my mother-in-law was already pouring herself a cup of coffee from the credenza, making herself at home, and the realtor was smiling like everything was completely normal, and I told myself I was being uptight. I sat down. I accepted the coffee I was offered. I started reading the documents. That's the thing I want every person watching this to understand. I read them. I always read everything. That's not me being exceptional. That's just basic financial self-preservation, something I'd learned the hard way years earlier when I almost signed a vendor contract that had an automatic renewal clause buried on page 8. Reading documents is a habit, a reflex. Page 11. Page 12. Standard title stuff. Page 13, 14, page 15. The name on the deed was not mine. It was my mother-in-law's name, full legal name, as the sole owner of record. I read it twice, 3 times. I looked up at my husband. He was watching me. And the thing I remember most, the thing that still makes my stomach turn when I think about it, is that he wasn't surprised. He wasn't waiting to see my reaction with any anxiety. He was just watching, like he'd been waiting for this moment and had already decided how it was going to go. "Just sign it, babe," he said. "We can sort out the name thing later. It's just a formality." "A formality," I repeated. "The financing worked out better this way. We'll fix the title after." I looked at the realtor. She was studying the mince bowl. I looked at my mother-in-law. She met my eyes and she actually smiled. Not a warm smile, a satisfied one. I put the pen down. "I'm not signing this." What followed was 20 minutes I will never forget. My husband went from calm to frustrated to angry in a way I'd never seen from him before in 3 years of marriage. He talked about tax advantages, which made no sense. Putting property in your mother's name has nothing to do with your personal tax liability. He talked about how these things work, as if I were someone who didn't understand how property transactions worked. He talked about the inconvenience of rescheduling, of disappointing the seller, and then, when none of that worked, he said the thing that gave everything away. He said, "You're humiliating my mother." His mother, who was sitting there, at my closing. For my property that I was buying with my money, I picked up my bag. I told the realtor we would not be proceeding today. I walked out. I drove home in silence. My husband didn't come home that night. I want to be honest about what the next 2 weeks looked like because I think people expect that once you see the thing, you act immediately. You don't always. I didn't. I spent a lot of those 2 weeks arguing with myself. Maybe there was a legitimate explanation I wasn't understanding. Maybe I'd overreacted. Maybe the problem was that I never fully trusted him and I was looking for proof of something that wasn't there. I called my accountant. I described the situation without naming names. She said there was no tax benefit she could identify that would require putting investment property in a parent's name instead of the purchaser's name. None. I called a real estate attorney. Same answer, different framing. She told me that if a buyer funds a purchase and the deed lists someone else as owner, the buyer has no legal claim to the property without additional documentation proving the intent. And even then, it's complicated. I went home that night and I started going through things. His laptop was in the office we shared. He'd been careless about it. Or maybe he was never worried I'd look, which tells you something about what he thought of me. I'm not going to say it felt good to look through his email. It didn't. It felt like the worst thing I'd ever done, right up until the moment I found what he'd been sending. There was an email thread. It started 14 months before our wedding. 14 months before we were even engaged. He'd been corresponding with a woman, an attorney, about setting up what she described as a family asset protection structure. The emails laid it out in plain language. The plan was to establish my mother-in-law as the titled owner of any significant real estate purchased during the marriage, using my income and credit to qualify for financing. Once properties were acquired and in her name, they would be outside the marital estate. In the event of divorce, I would have no claim. There was more. He had opened a credit card in what appeared to be a joint account, but the billing address was his parents' house in Delaware. I hadn't received a single statement. 18 months of charges. I recognized some of the merchants, restaurants we'd been to together, a weekend trip we'd taken to Asheville. Other charges I didn't recognize at all. There was a second email address he used for financial correspondence. The display name on that account was my name, not him, me. He had created an account with my name on it so that if I ever glanced at a CC line on an email, I'd see my own name and think nothing of it. He had done this before. I don't say that lightly. There were emails referencing the situation with Rebecca, a name I didn't recognize, and language that made it clear this was not the first time he had run this playbook. He'd learned from it, apparently. He'd refined it. I sat on the floor of my office at 2 a.m, and I thought about every single thing I had told him. Every client, every contract, every number, every vulnerability I'd shown him because I thought that was what intimacy was. And then I called my attorney. I want to be clear about what happened over the following 6 weeks because I think people assume revenge stories are satisfying in a clean, movie-like way. They're not. They're exhausting and expensive, and there are days you second-guess every decision you've made, including the ones that were obviously right. My attorney was someone I'd worked with on business matters before, a woman I trusted completely. When I sat across from her and laid out what I'd found, she didn't look shocked. She looked focused. That's what you want in an attorney. You don't want sympathy. You want someone who sees a problem and starts building a solution. We moved carefully. That was her first instruction. Don't tip him off. Don't change behavior. Don't access accounts in unusual ways. Document everything, but do it quietly. I had screenshots of the emails. I had screenshots of the credit card statements. I had a record of the failed closing and the realtor's presence, which my attorney noted was worth examining further. I had the name of the attorney he'd corresponded with about the asset protection scheme, which opened a separate line of inquiry. I filed for divorce 6 weeks after the closing. I did it on a Thursday morning, and my attorney arranged for him to be served at his office. I found out later that his colleagues saw it happen. That part I didn't plan, but I won't pretend I was heartbroken about it. The fraud case took longer. These things do. But the evidence was clean, and the paper trail was detailed, and the attorney he'd consulted with about the scheme had, in her own documentation, created a very thorough record of the intent. My attorney also contacted the realtor. She cooperated once it became clear that her participation, knowing the deed had been changed from what the buyer had agreed to, put her own license at risk. My mother-in-law was named in the civil complaint. She had accepted title to property she knew was being fraudulently obtained. She claimed she hadn't known the full picture. The emails said otherwise. My husband was charged with wire fraud and identity fraud. The email account he'd created in my name had been used to conduct financial correspondence, and some of that correspondence crossed state lines. His attorney tried to negotiate. My attorney was not in a negotiating mood. He pled guilty to a reduced charge, 18 months, minimum security plus restitution. His mother received a civil judgment against her and was required to cooperate with the return of any assets transferred in connection with the scheme. The realtor lost her license. Was it enough? Probably not. 18 months feels short when you think about 14 months of premeditated planning before the wedding. When you think about Rebecca, whoever she is, and whatever she lost. When you think about what the plan was if I had just signed. But it was something. I sold the townhouse 8 months after the divorce was finalized. Too many memories. Not all of them bad. Which was somehow worse. I moved into a rental in a neighborhood I'd always liked, but never let myself live in because it felt like an indulgence. I bought a nice couch. I got a dog. The business is still mine. Grew by about 30% in the 2 years since all of this happened, partly because I was no longer spending emotional energy managing someone else's agenda. My accountant made a comment about it at our last quarterly review. She said something about how the numbers look different when you're the only one with access to them. She meant it as a practical observation. I took it as something more. I've been asked, a lot, whether I saw the signs, whether there were things I ignored or explained away. The honest answer is yes. The way his mother showed up everywhere and he never thought it was worth addressing. The way certain financial conversations would subtly redirect. He'd ask a question about my revenue, and somehow I'd end up explaining myself instead of getting an answer. The way charming was the word everyone used to describe him, including me, for 3 years. I know now that charming is almost always how we describe someone who is very good at making you feel seen while they are studying you. There's a difference between being known and being mapped. I mistook one for the other for a long time. I'm not telling this story because I think I was uniquely foolish. I don't. I think I was a fairly smart person who trusted the wrong man at the wrong time, which is a thing that happens to very smart people constantly. I'm telling it because the details matter, the specific, boring, unsexy details, the name on page 15, the billing address at his parents' house, the email display name that was mine but wasn't. Those details are what saved me. Read everything, every page, every line, every name. And if someone tells you to just sign and sort it out later, especially on something that cost you 7 years of your life to build, put the pen down. That's the whole lesson. I wish it had cost me less to learn it. I've thought about the sequence of events a lot since everything came out. Not obsessively, I moved past that stage, but in the way you turn a stone over and look at what's underneath, because understanding it matters more to me than being angry about it. What I keep coming back to is this. Nothing about what happened to me was random. Every piece of it followed a logic. My husband didn't wake up one morning and decide to commit fraud. He built it slowly, over months and years, because he believed I wouldn't look closely enough. He counted on the assumption that trust would function as a blindfold, and for a while, he was right. I trusted him. I told him everything. I let love stand in for due diligence, which is a thing a lot of people do, and a thing that has nothing to do with how smart you are. That's the part I had to sit with. Not the betrayal itself. Betrayal is something other people do to you, but my own role in leaving the door open. I had the skills to protect myself. I had the habit of reading contracts, of checking numbers, of asking questions. I applied those skills everywhere except in the place that mattered most. I turned them off at home because I thought home was safe. That was my part. I own it. But here's what I also know. The moment I put that pen down at the closing table, something shifted. Not heroically, not dramatically. I didn't have a plan. I just had a refusal. I refused to sign something that didn't look right, even when the person I loved most in the world was sitting next to me telling me it was fine. That one act of stubbornness, really, that's all it was. Stubbornness and a habit I'd built over years of protecting my own work. That act is what unraveled everything. He had planned for a lot of things. He had not planned for me to read page 15. The realtor cooperated because she had something to lose. His emails were detailed because he was organized and thorough and believed the whole thing would work. His mother accepted that deed because she thought I was the kind of woman who defers. Every assumption they made about me turned out to be wrong. Not because I'm exceptional, but because I'd spent years learning that no one protects your interests better than you do. That's not cynicism. That's just experience. Tara asked me once, after it was all over, whether I regretted the marriage. I thought about it honestly before I answered. I said no, not because it was worth it, but because regret isn't useful. What happened happened. What I have now is clearer vision, a better understanding of the specific ways people can use intimacy as a strategy, and a dog who has never once tried to put anything in anyone else's name. The lesson isn't, don't trust people. The lesson is that trust and verification aren't opposites. You can love someone and still read the document. You can be a good partner and still know your own numbers. Giving someone access to your life doesn't mean giving them the ability to reroute it. Those are different things, and knowing the difference is not a failure of love. It's intelligence and practice. I built something. It took years, and it cost me sleep and vacations and a social life I'm still partially rebuilding. Nobody gets to take that from me because I was too polite to check the paperwork. Not then. Not ever again.